In this video, you're going to build a picture gallery very similar to the one you built in the Flexbox chapter, but this time you're going to use the CSS grid layout. So the final design is going to work as following. The pictures are going to be laid out inside rows like this, and if you reduce the width of your browser, the number of columns is going to decrease until it reaches one column. So here is your starting design. So all you need to do is apply the grid properties to your elements so that you reach the final design. So let's go ahead and do this. So at the moment we've got a div of class container containing all the images. So at the moment we don't have any styling, and if you want to get rid of the box sizing property you can do that. I only kept it just in case I need to add any padding or border to elements later on. So if you want to delete it, you can just go ahead and do that. So now I'm going to select the container using its class and make it a grid container by setting its display property to grid. So since the number of columns is going to change, and so the number of rows depending on the screen size, I'm not going to specify the number of columns and rows in the styling, but instead I'm going to auto-complete the grid by specifying only the dimensions I want for the columns. So what I'm going to do I'm going to set the grid template columns using the repeat function, and I'm going to auto fill, and now I'm going to specify the dimensions that I want for the columns. Now if you look at the final design, you can see that as I reduce the width of the container, once the images hit a certain width, then the number of columns changes. This means that we've got a minimum width in our styling. So we're going to use min max right there, and we're going to set the min to something like 300 pixels, and the max is going to be one free space. So this means that the browser is going to look for the best configuration to fit our columns in one free space, which fulfills the condition width of the column greater than 300 pixels. All right. So in a screen like this, we're going to go for 4 columns, each column occupying 1/4 of the width of the container. If I reduce the width, then the browser will do calculations and will find out that 3 columns is actually the optimal number, which will verify width of the columns greater than 300 pixels. All right. So that's how it works. Now I've got a hyphen missing right there, and let's have a look at our current layout and see how it looks like. Well, it does look like a grid, but the dimensions of our images are not right. So what I need to do is make sure that the maximum width of the images is contained inside their cell. So to do this, I'm going to select the images by going to the container and selecting the image tag and specifying the maximum width, which we're going to set to 100%. Now it looks better. And you can see that our grid does work. Now if I reduce the width of the container, I can see that the number of columns does change depending on the width of the container. Now let's improve our layout by adding a gutter to our grid using the grid gap property, and let's go for 5 pixels, for example. That looks alright. Also, let's add some padding to our container of 7 pixels. And now it looks very similar to the final layout. But if you look closely at the final layout, you'll see that the pictures are actually aligned vertically inside their rows. And hopefully you remember how to do that. In the grid layout, that's going to be using the align items property, which I'm going to set to center. Now the pictures are aligned vertically inside their rows. And the exercise is now complete. Now you just need to note a couple of points here. We auto completed our grid by specifying the dimensions of the columns only, because we don't know how many rows we're going to have depending on the size of the screen. All right. Also, we didn't have to use media queries for different screen sizes. And that's thanks to the min-max function, which we used to set the dimensions of our columns. And that's a very handy technique, which will allow you to build responsive designs without having to use media queries. Also, there is another technique that you can use to visualize the grid layout inside your browser. So if you're using Chrome, you can just inspect the grid. And if you go to the grid container and select it, then it's going to show you the layout of your grid. So if I select or just hover on the container div, then I can see the structure of my grid. So if I reduce the screen size and hover again, I can still see the structure, which has now changed from 4 columns to 3 columns. So you can see the grid items, their limits, you can see the gutter between the grid items, etc. And each square or rectangle you see in this visualization will refer to one cell inside your grid. So in our case, one grid item occupies only one cell. So that's why you can see the grid items being highlighted. But in other scenarios, you will see that one grid item will be made of a few cells. And this is a very handy way of understanding how the grid layout renders in your browser. All right, in the next video, you're going to move to another example, building a new grid layout using other techniques you learned so far.